"Be quiet, old man. Your time is over. This is my town now and my stage. People are here to celebrate progress, not listen to some dusty war story from forgotten conflict." The words, slick with arrogance and dripping with condescension, sliced through the crisp autumn air, echoing unnaturally from the portable sound system set up on the town green. The crowd, a mix of local families, politicians, and a somber assembly of veterans, shifted uncomfortably. A few sycophantic chuckles erupted from the front row, where the speaker's entourage of city council allies sat. But mostly, a wave of embarrassed silence washed over the attendees. The man on the receiving end of the insult, Samuel Thorne, a Vietnam veteran with eyes that held the quiet weight of history, simply lowered the microphone from his lips. He didn't flinch. He didn't retort. He merely stood there, his worn VFW cap held respectfully in his hand, a silent testament to a dignity the man on the podium could never comprehend. But across the green, leaning against an ancient oak tree just beyond the polite perimeter of the crowd, a woman watched. She was unremarkable in every way the world measured such things. Faded jeans, a simple gray Henley, hair pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. She could have been a graduate student, a local librarian, a tourist passing through. Her face was a mask of placid neutrality, her posture relaxed yet underpinned by an almost imperceptible stillness, a coiled energy held in perfect economic reserve. She offered no reaction to the insult hurled at her father. No gasp of outrage, no clenching of her fists. Her gaze remained level, her breathing even. This was Lieutenant Commander Maya Thorne, and her calm was not an absence of feeling, but a deep and total mastery of it. The man on the stage, a local real estate developer named Rexford Sterling, who had funded the new memorial wall, and in doing so believed he had purchased the soul of the town's military history, preened under the floodlights. He saw an old man who needed to be put in his place. He saw a crowd to be dominated. He saw his name etched in granite and his legacy cemented. He did not see the woman under the tree. He did not see the way her eyes, the same color as her father's but honed to a different, sharper purpose, were not merely watching him, but deconstructing him. His posture, his balance, the nervous tick in his jaw, the slight tremor in the hand that wasn't gripping the lectern. He did not see the predator's gaze behind the placid mask. He saw what she wanted him to see, nothing. And in his blindness, his fate was already sealed. He had made a catastrophic assumption, the kind of assumption that echoes in the silent, unforgiving classrooms of places he couldn't imagine. He assumed the quiet was weakness. He assumed the stillness was fear. He assumed the old man and the daughter who stood in the shadows were relics of a past he had surpassed. But a retired four-star general sitting near the front, a guest of honor, saw something different. He saw the old veteran's dignified silence and recognized the strength it took. And then his eyes, drawn by some professional instinct, scanned the periphery and found the woman under the tree. He saw her stance, the way her weight was perfectly centered, the subtle but absolute economy of her presence. It was a ghost of a memory, a familiar silhouette from 1,000 different hostile landscapes, and a cold premonition slid down his spine. The developer was speaking to a crowd, but he was provoking a standard of competence he could not possibly survive. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type quiet professional in the comments below. The air grew thick with a tension that Sterling, in his bubble of self-importance, mistook for rapt attention. He continued his tirade, using Samuel Thorne as a prop for his own magnanimity. "We must look forward," he boomed, gesturing with a grandiose sweep of his arm. "To new buildings, new commerce. We honor the past, of course," he added, a patronizing nod towards the new black granite wall. "But we cannot be shackled by it. Men like Mr. Thorne here did their part, and for that, we give them a nice wall and a day of recognition. But the future belongs to the builders, the innovators, the men of action who shape the world of today." The irony was a physical force, so potent it seemed to warp the very light around him. He spoke of action while the very embodiment of decisive, lethal action stood observing him from the shade of the oak, her expression unchanged. Samuel had only wanted to correct the record. Sterling, in his dedication speech, had mistakenly attributed a famous battle quote from the 101st Airborne to the Marines. It was a small thing, a minor error, but to a man like Samuel, whose friends' names were carved into the real wall in Washington, D.C., details mattered. History was not a prop. It was a testament forged in blood and sacrifice, and it deserved the simple respect of accuracy. His attempt to gently correct the speaker was not an act of ego, but of custodianship. It was this quiet act of preservation that Sterling's brittle pride could not tolerate. He saw it as a challenge to his authority, an unwelcome intrusion into his meticulously orchestrated performance. The crowd's unease began to curdle into a low murmur of disapproval. The veterans, in particular, sat straighter, their faces hardening into stony masks of contempt. They had seen men like Sterling before, men who confused wealth with worth and volume with valor. They knew the type intimately. They were the ones who sent others to fight the wars they profited from, the ones who waved the flag the hardest and understood it the least. From her vantage point, Maya Thorne continued her assessment. She was no longer just observing Sterling. She was charting the emotional topography of the entire scene. She noted the subtle shift in the body language of the local police chief, his hand hovering unconsciously near his belt. She saw the mayor's forced, pained smile, a politician trapped between a major donor and public decency. She tracked the gazes of the other veterans, seeing the flicker of shared anger, a silent communication passing between men who had long ago learned to speak without words. Her mind worked like a threat assessment algorithm, processing data, calculating probabilities, and mapping out potential responses with chilling efficiency. Her own emotional state was a flat line, a deep, still reservoir of calm that her training had carved into her very soul. Anger was a luxury. Outrage was a tactical flaw. What was required was clarity, and clarity was her craft. The world for her was a series of problems to be solved, and Rexford Sterling was escalating from a simple annoyance into a tactical problem. A problem that was now moving, leaving the relative safety of the podium and stalking toward her father, his face a mask of theatrical fury. Sterling was about to learn a lesson that is taught only in the most unforgiving of environments. The most dangerous thing in the world is to underestimate the quiet ones, because their silence is not empty. It is full. It is full of observation, of preparation, of a discipline so profound it becomes a physical law. It is the silence of the abyss, the calm before the storm, the patient, waiting stillness of the professional who knows with absolute certainty how the story is going to end because they're the one who will write the ending. Rexford Sterling descended the 3 short steps from the portable stage with the unearned confidence of a king descending from his throne. He was a man accustomed to the world rearranging itself to suit his whims, a reality reinforced by a lifetime of sycophants and financial leverage. He saw Samuel Thorne not as a man, but as a nail that needed to be hammered down. As he closed the distance, his voice dropped to a mock confidential roar, intended for the front rows to overhear. "Let me explain something to you, old-timer," he snarled, jabbing a finger towards Samuel's chest. "Respect is earned. You don't get a lifetime pass just because you got shot at 50 years ago. You want respect? Stay in your lane. Stay quiet." The crowd audibly gasped. The insult was so profound, so dismissive of the very reason they were all gathered, that it shattered the last vestiges of civic politeness. Samuel Thorne, however, remained rooted to the spot. He simply looked at Sterling, his gaze not angry, but filled with a deep, weary pity. It was the look of a man who had seen true monsters and recognized the pathetic, blustering imitation standing before him. This look of pity, more than any shouted retort, was what finally broke Sterling's fragile control. It was a look that said, "You have no power here." Enraged by this silent refutation, Sterling's hand came up. It was not a punch, not yet, but a clear, aggressive move to shove, to physically dominate the old soldier and force the submission he couldn't achieve with words. It was the precipice the moment of irreversible escalation. And it was the precise moment Maya Thorne decided to solve the problem. She didn't run. She didn't charge. Her movement was a fluid ghost, a whisper of motion that the eye barely registered. One moment she was by the tree, 30 feet away. The next, she was a silent presence gliding through the parting crowd. Her footfalls made no sound on the manicured grass. Her face remained a mask of detached professionalism. The narrator of this moment would not speak of anger or revenge, but of physics. They would speak of biomechanics, of leverage, of the elegant and brutal mathematics of force redirection. Sterling's forward momentum, fueled by ego and adrenaline, was a vector of energy. Maya's intervention was not a counterforce, but a fulcrum. As his hand reached for her father's shoulder, her hand, moving with the deceptive speed of a striking snake, intercepted his wrist. Her grip was not one of crushing strength, but of anatomical precision. Her thumb found the nerve cluster, her fingers locked onto the bone, and in the same seamless, fluid motion, she used his own momentum, his own lunge to guide him. There was no grunt, no sound of struggle. She simply turned, pivoting on the ball of her foot, and Sterling's entire body followed the path of least resistance she had created for him. He was a marionette whose strings had been expertly seized. He went down, not in a crash, but in a controlled, almost graceful spiral, his expensive suit jacket billowing around him as he landed on the grass, completely off balance, bewildered, and utterly unharmed. His lunge, which was meant to be an act of public domination, had been transformed into a pirouette of public humiliation. The immediate aftermath was not noise, but its opposite. A profound, deafening silence fell over the town green. The chirping of birds in the distant trees, previously unnoticed, suddenly seemed loud. The rustle of the autumn leaves was a roar. The collective breath of 200 people was held in a state of suspended disbelief. They had witnessed something impossible. There had been no violence, no struggle, no sound of impact. A large, aggressive man had lunged, and a quiet, unassuming woman had danced with him, guided him. It was too fast, too clean, too utterly efficient to be processed as a common brawl. It was something else entirely, something that defied their shared vocabulary of conflict. Rexford Sterling lay on the grass, not in pain, but in a state of pure, unadulterated shock. His mind, which operated on simple binaries of dominance and submission, could not compute the data it had just received. He hadn't been hit. He hadn't been tripped. He had been moved. He felt as if gravity itself had briefly conspired against him, twisting him to the ground with an invisible, omnipotent hand. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his face a canvas of confusion and sputtering rage. What the hell was that? He stammered, his voice robbed of all its earlier booming authority. Maya Thorne paid him no attention. Her focus, her entire world, had narrowed to a single point: her father. She stood over him, not protectively, but as a calm, reassuring presence. "Are you all right, Dad?" Her voice was low, steady, and devoid of any discernible emotion. It was the voice of a pilot running through a checklist, a surgeon confirming a patient's status. It was the voice of pure, unadulterated competence. Samuel Thorne looked at his daughter, and a slow, faint smile touched his lips. He reached up and gently straightened the collar of her Henley. "I'm fine, Maya. Just fine." His voice was laced with a quiet pride that was deeper than any ocean. He had not been afraid of Sterling, but he lived in quiet, constant awe of what his daughter had become. He knew what that seamless, silent movement represented. He knew the years of pain, the sacrifice, the discipline forged in crucibles he could barely imagine that were required to make something so violent look so peaceful. He understood that he had just witnessed not an act of aggression, but an act of supreme control. It was the application of a terrifying power with such precision that it manifested as its opposite, grace. The crowd finally exhaled, and the silence was replaced by a torrent of whispers, a wave of murmuring that rippled from the front row to the very back. "Did you see that?" Where did she come from? He didn't even touch him. The questions flew, but no one had an answer. They were all witnesses to a mystery, a brief, stunning tear in the fabric of their ordinary Saturday afternoon. Rexford Sterling, a man who had built his entire identity on being the center of attention, was now just a confused man on the ground, completely forgotten. The focus had shifted irrevocably to the quiet woman and the old soldier she called Dad. Out of the stunned silence, a new presence emerged. A man rose from his seat in the front row, his movements deliberate and imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with wealth or title and everything to do with a lifetime of command. He was older, perhaps 70, with a shock of white hair and a posture that defied age. He wore a simple navy blue suit, but he wore it like a uniform. This was General Marcus Miller, retired, former commander of Joint Special Operations Command, the event's forgotten keynote speaker. He had been watching the entire exchange not with the shock of the civilians, but with the focused, analytical gaze of a master craftsman observing the work of another. While the crowd saw a confusing, rapid event, he saw a sequence, a technique as familiar and as unmistakable to him as his own signature. He saw the subtle shift in the woman's center of gravity before she moved. He saw the precise angle of her wrist lock, a textbook application of small circle jiu-jitsu, favored by certain units for its non-lethal efficiency. He saw the absolute control in the takedown, the way she protected Sterling's head from hitting the ground even as she humiliated him. It was not the move of a brawler or a martial artist. It was the work of a Tier 1 operator. General Miller walked past the sputtering Rexford Sterling without a glance. He ignored the frantic whispers of the mayor. He walked directly to where Maya Thorne stood beside her father, and he stopped a respectful 3 feet away. The crowd, sensing a new chapter in the unfolding drama, fell silent once more. The general's eyes, sharp and intelligent, met Maya's. There was a flicker of recognition, not of her as an individual, but of her as a type, a member of a tribe he knew better than his own family. That was a C force redirection maneuver. The general's voice was not loud, but it carried across the green with the clarity of a command. It was calm, authoritative, and final. Perfectly executed. Minimal force, maximum control. You protected the asset from himself. I haven't seen it done that cleanly outside of a kill house at Dam Neck. He paused, his gaze unwavering. Who are you, Commander? The word commander landed like a thunderclap. It was a title, a rank, spoken with the casual certainty of one professional addressing another. It recontextualized everything the crowd had just seen. The faded jeans, the ponytail, the unremarkable appearance. It was all camouflage. The title stripped it away, revealing the steel beneath. Rexford Sterling, now sitting up on the grass, stared in disbelief. The mayor's jaw went slack. Maya Thorne's expression did not change. She simply stood a little straighter, a subtle shift that acknowledged the general's rank and his perception. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, sir, she replied. Her voice was flat, respectful, a simple statement of fact. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The name of the unit, DevGRU, hung in the air, largely meaningless to the civilians present. But to the veterans in the crowd, and especially to General Miller, it was a revelation of staggering significance. It was the official, unclassified name for the unit more commonly whispered about in awe and myth, SEAL Team 6. It was not just a unit, it was a legend. It was the tip of the spear, the silent professionals sent to the darkest corners of the world to solve problems the nation wasn't even allowed to admit it had. To the general, hearing that designation spoken on a quiet town green was as jarring as seeing a nuclear submarine surface in a public swimming pool. He looked from Maya, this quiet, unassuming woman, to the proud, dignified old soldier beside her. The pieces clicked into place with the satisfying certainty of a rifle bolt sliding home. This was not just a daughter protecting her father. This was a legacy, a torch passed from one generation of warrior to the next, from the muddy battlefields of Vietnam to the shadowy, high-stakes conflicts of the modern age. The general's entire demeanor softened. The hard edge of the commander was replaced by a profound, almost reverent respect. He turned his body slightly, creating a subtle barrier between the thorns and the gawking crowd, and lowered his voice. "Your father is Samuel Thorne," he stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. 75th Rangers, Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol, Distinguished Service Cross, 68, for action in the Shao Valley. Samuel Thorne looked stunned. "Sir, how did you know that?" General Miller allowed himself a small, rare smile. "Your file crossed my desk years ago, Sergeant Thorne, when a young candidate for BUD/S listed you as her inspiration. The name stuck. The story stuck. We don't forget men like you." He then turned his gaze back to the crowd, and his voice regained its full command authority. He was no longer a participant. He was the validator, the final arbiter of the truth they had all just witnessed. He addressed the mayor, but his words were meant for everyone, especially for the humiliated developer still sitting on the grass. "For those of you who are confused," the general began, his voice ringing with cold, righteous anger, "let me be perfectly clear. You did not just witness a fight. You witnessed a professional de-escalation of a clear and present threat. You saw a highly trained officer of the United States Navy use the absolute minimum level of force necessary to protect a decorated combat veteran from an unprovoked assault." He let that sink in, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the crowd. Lieutenant Commander Thorne's actions were a textbook display of the discipline, control, and judgment that we pray for in our nation's finest warriors. She showed more restraint in that single moment than some people show in a lifetime. His eyes finally settled on Rexford Sterling, and the temperature on the green seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You demanded that a hero be quiet. You should thank God that this hero," he gestured to Maya, "chose to be." With that, General Miller turned back to Maya Thorne. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together, and rendered a salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer, but the crisp, formal salute of profound respect, a gesture that acknowledged not just her rank, but her character. The quiet professional had been validated. The loud pretender had been silenced. And the truth, in all its quiet, devastating competence, had finally been revealed. The story of the town Green takedown, as it came to be known, did not just spread, it detonated. In the age of smartphones, a dozen different angles of the event were online within the hour. The initial clips were confusing, titled with sensationalist headings like, "Woman Flips Out at Town Meeting." But soon, context began to flood the digital space, provided by the veterans in attendance and amplified by General Miller's impromptu, authoritative speech, which someone had also recorded. The narrative shifted with incredible speed. It became a viral case study in misplaced arrogance and quiet professionalism. The story ripped through military circles like wildfire. It was shared on private forums for special operators, on Facebook groups for veterans of every branch, and texted from one service member to another across the globe. To the outside world, it was a moment of satisfying karmic justice. But to the military community, it was something more. It was a perfect, crystalline example of their most deeply held values. Maya's actions became a teaching point. Instructors at Fort Benning and Paris Island showed the clip to new recruits. "Look," they would say, pointing to the screen. "See that? No emotion. No emotion. Total control. That is what we are trying to build. That is a warrior." The focus was never on the takedown itself, but on the profound stillness that preceded it and the calm professionalism that followed. The legend of Maya Thorne grew not from the act of violence she was capable of, but from the act of restraint she chose. Rexford Sterling's life, meanwhile, unraveled. He became a local pariah. The video was his public obituary. Every channel played it. Every local blog dissected it. His name became synonymous with entitled arrogance. Business partners grew distant. Contracts were mysteriously canceled. The city council, who had once courted him, now refused his calls. He was forced to issue a groveling, humiliating public apology, which was widely seen as a desperate, insincere attempt at damage control. He had built an empire on a foundation of bluster and intimidation. And in a single, silent, 30-second encounter, a quiet woman had demolished it down to the bedrock. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. The respect he had demanded from Samuel Thorne was something his money could never buy and his power could never seize. It had to be earned, and he had proven himself utterly bankrupt. Maya, for her part, disappeared. The day after the incident, she drove her father home, shared a quiet breakfast with him, and then left, her simple duffel bag thrown in the back of her nondescript pickup truck. She was gone, back to the shadows where she belonged. When a tenacious local reporter finally managed to get a contact number for the Naval Special Warfare Command Public Affairs Office, the response was predictably terse. "We have no comment on the personal, off-duty activities of any alleged service member." The official wall of silence was absolute. But unofficially, the pride within the command was immense. She had upheld their code in the most public way possible, without seeking an ounce of credit. She hadn't been looking for a fight. She had simply been a daughter, standing by her father. The symbolism of the event took on a life of its own. The specific spot on the green where Sterling had been humbled became an unofficial landmark. A week after the incident, someone left a single, polished Navy SEAL Trident Challenge coin on the bench where Samuel Thorne had been sitting. The next day, a Ranger Tab coin appeared beside it, then a Marine Corps coin, then one from the 101st Airborne. Soon, the bench was covered in them, a silent, glittering tribute from a brotherhood of warriors to the quiet professional and the old soldier she had defended. The Thorne Bench, as it was now called, had become a shrine to a new kind of local legend, a legend not about a battle in a distant land, but about a quiet, moral victory won on a Saturday afternoon on the town green. The echoes of that autumn afternoon resonated far beyond the town limits, embedding themselves into the very culture of the community and the military that observed it from afar. The Thorne Bench became more than just a landmark. It became a symbol, a place of quiet pilgrimage for visiting veterans and a tangible reminder for the locals. The town, once cowed by Rexford Sterling's money, had been given a new moral compass. They had been reminded that character was not measured in square footage or bank balances, but in quiet dignity and selfless action. The incident forced a collective soul-searching. The mayor, deeply embarrassed by his own complicity and inaction, formed a new Veterans Advisory Council, with Samuel Thorne unanimously elected as its first chairman. The goal was to ensure that the voices of the town's veterans would never again be silenced, but instead be actively sought and honored. The local police department formally incorporated the video of Maya's takedown into their de-escalation training curriculum. It was presented as a masterclass in control, a perfect example of how to neutralize a threat without causing harm, a lesson made all the more potent by the fact that it came not from a police instructor, but from a quiet woman in a gray Henley. Rexford Sterling, for his part, underwent a forced and painful transformation. Stripped of his social standing and public influence, he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own ego. He sold his properties and left town, a humbled and diminished figure. Some whispered that he had finally learned his lesson, while others believed he was simply seeking a new town where his reputation hadn't preceded him. But either way, his reign of loud, empty arrogance was over. The legend that grew around Maya was unique. It was a legend built on absence. She never returned. She never gave an interview. Her name was never officially mentioned in any reports. She remained a ghost, a silhouette against an oak tree. This very lack of presence amplified her myth. She became a folk hero, a figure representing the countless quiet professionals who walk among us, their extraordinary abilities hidden behind a veil of normalcy. Stories about her, most of them apocryphal, were told and retold. Some said she could disappear in a thin air. Others claimed she could speak a dozen languages. She became a local boogeyman for bullies, a whispered warning to those who confuse kindness with weakness. The truth, of course, was that she was simply a professional doing her job. Her job, on that day, was being a daughter. The real, lasting impact was on the next generation. Young men and women from the town began enlisting in the military in greater numbers. not drawn by posters of glorified combat, but inspired by the story of a woman who embodied the highest ideals of service, discipline, restraint, and quiet competence. They didn't want to be action heroes. They wanted to be like Maya Thorne. They wanted to possess a strength so profound it didn't need to be displayed, a confidence so absolute it didn't need to be spoken. The ripples of her single, silent action had created a legacy of service that would continue for decades, a testament to the enduring power of leading by quiet, decisive example. A year to the day after the incident, the town gathered again on the green. This time, the atmosphere was different. The cheap portable stage was gone, replaced by a permanent, dignified granite dais. The mood was not one of forced celebration, but of genuine, solemn respect. The event was a rededication of the Veterans Memorial Wall, a chance to do it right. General Miller had returned, this time not just as a guest, but as a friend of the town. He stood at the new lectern and looked out at the crowd, his eyes finding Samuel Thorne in the front row, sitting proudly on the now-famous Thorne bench, which was adorned with a simple bronze plaque that read, "In honor of those who listen and those who protect," the general began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of the last year. A year ago, on this very spot, he started, we were given a lesson. Not a lesson in warfare, but a lesson in character. We were reminded that the measure of a person is not the volume of their voice, but the depth of their integrity. We were reminded that the greatest strength is not the power to dominate, but the discipline to control. He spoke of Samuel Thorne, of his generation's sacrifice, and of the quiet dignity with which they carried their burdens. He then spoke of the incident, not to relitigate Sterling's shame, but to elevate the principle that Maya's actions had so perfectly embodied. We witnessed what happens when loud arrogance collides with quiet competence, he declared, his voice rising with passion. Arrogance, you see, is a fragile thing. It is a hollow fortress built of ego and noise. Competence, true competence, is a foundation of solid rock, built of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless practice. It makes no noise. It needs no advertisement. It simply is. And when the storm comes, the fortress of noise is washed away. While the silent rock remains, the story had become institutional folklore, a foundational myth for a community that had redefined itself. It was a teaching tool, a parable told to every newcomer, to every child in the local schools. The moral was clear and powerful. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Do not assume the unassuming are without power. And above all, understand that respect is a currency that can only be earned through action, and it is paid in kind by those who recognize its true worth. The legend was no longer just about a takedown. It was about the quiet, unwavering strength that underpins a just and civil society, the strength embodied by the old soldier who refused to be silenced, and the quiet professional who ensured he would always be heard. The legacy of that day was not an ending, but a beginning, a continuous ripple of inspiration spreading outward, touching countless lives and shaping a community for the better. True legacy, the kind that endures, is not etched in stone or memorialized in bronze. It is not found in the grand pronouncements of powerful men or the towering monuments they build to their own egos. A true legacy is a living thing. It is a standard that is passed on, a principle that is embodied, a quiet truth that inspires action in others. The legacy of Lieutenant Commander Maya Thorne was not what happened on that day, but what continued to happen every day after. It was in the way the local police officer chose to de-escalate a confrontation with patient words instead of force. It was in a high school student who stood up for a classmate being bullied, not with fists, but with a quiet, unwavering presence. It was in the renewed sense of pride and respect the town showed its veterans, no longer seeing them as relics of the past, but as living pillars of the community. Maya's single act of profound, disciplined competence had recalibrated the town's moral center. She had held up a mirror, forcing everyone to see the chasm between loud claims and quiet deeds, between the arrogance of entitlement and the nobility of service. Her father, Samuel Thorne, now the respected chairman of the Veterans Council, became the living custodian of that legacy. He never spoke of his daughter's specific profession, but he spoke often of her character. Strength is quiet, he would tell young people. The deepest rivers make the least sound. Be a deep river. Know your worth so completely that you never feel the need to announce it. The story became a quiet promise, a piece of foundational folklore that would be told for generations. It served as a permanent reminder that the world is full of quiet professionals, men and women of extraordinary skill and character, hidden in plain sight. They're the nurses, the teachers, the technicians, the soldiers, the unassuming neighbors who possess a core of competence and integrity that is the true bedrock of society. They seek no applause. They ask for no recognition. They simply do the work. They're the standard. And on one crisp autumn day, the world was reminded that when arrogance forces a confrontation with that standard, the outcome is never, ever in doubt. The silent, steady hand of competence will always, inevitably, guide the loud, flailing fist of ego straight into the ground. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over ignorant arrogance, and where silent strength defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.